I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, since my last briefing to the Security Council on this topic only weeks ago, the provision of defensive military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine has continued in the context of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine launched by the Russian Federation on 24th of February 2022 in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. Much of the information on transfers of weapon systems and ammunition flows from governments is available through open sources. These transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions, small arms and light weapons, and their ammunition. Over the last months, reported transfers of arms and ammunition to the Ukrainian Defense Forces have expanded. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons, such as uncrewed aerial vehicles and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, including for possible use in Ukraine. Needless to say, any transfer of weapons must take place within the applicable international legal and policy frameworks, including relevant Security Council resolutions. Any potential or suspected violations of relevant Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions or restrictive measures, if verified, are very concerning. Reports related to the transfer and use of cluster munitions throughout the war are also very concerning. The Secretary General has repeatedly called for an immediate end to the use of cluster munitions. In line with his long-standing position, these weapons must be consigned to history. Most recently, in his policy brief on New Agenda for Peace, the Secretary General has encouraged member states to commit to reducing the human cost of weapons, including by achieving universal participation in treaties banning inhumane and indiscriminate weapons, such as the Convention on Cluster Munitions. We also take note of reports related to the transfer of depleted uranium tank ammunition to the Ukrainian forces. The supply of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict situations raises significant concerns about the potential escalation of violence and presents significant risks of diversion and proliferation even after the conflict has ended. Measures to address the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition to unauthorized end users and for unauthorized uses are essential for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such measures include enforcement of marking practices, comprehensive pre-transfer diversion risk assessments, end-user certificates, including non-transfer clauses, effective legal and enforcement measures, and post-shipment verifications. To prevent the diversion of weapons, supply chains transparency and cooperation and information exchange between importing, transit, and exporting states is required, as well as concrete measures such as marking and tracing, effective accounting, and comprehensive record-keeping practices, physical safeguarding of arms and ammunition, customs and border control measures, and diversion monitoring and analysis. As I mentioned many times before, transparency in arms transfers is a crucial confidence-building measure, which can serve to reduce tensions and ambiguities between member states. The UN Register of Conventional Arms, UNROCA, remains a key instrument in this regard. In its 30 years of operation, 178 member states have submitted a report to UNRWA at least once. I call upon member states to participate in this mechanism. UNRWA captures around 90% of our global arms flows and can help in tracking the influx of weapons in conflict zones. Moreover, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and its International Tracing Instrument are some of the arms control instruments established by states to prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate international arms trade. I welcome the conclusion of work of the Open-Ended Working Group, or EWG, on conventional ammunition and applaud the successful adoption of its final report containing the new global framework for through-life conventional ammunition management. The framework is much-needed instrument to more effectively counter the diversion of conventional ammunition of all types, which continue to fuel instability, insecurity, and conflict across the world. I reiterate my call to all states to join relevant treaties and agreements and to fully implement their legal obligations under conventional arms control instruments to which they are party, as well as their political commitments to minimize the risk of diversion of arms and ammunition. Madam President, beyond addressing arms transfers, all parties to armed conflict have a duty to protect civilians in armed conflict and to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. From 24th of February 2022 to 27th of August this year, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 26,717 civilian casualties in Ukraine, with 9,511 killed and 17,206 injured. The actual figures are likely to be considered considerably higher. The vast majority of civilian casualties are a result of the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including by shelling from artillery, tanks and multiple launch rocket systems, cruise and ballistic missiles, and by airstrikes. The continued use of large numbers of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles against civilians and civilian infrastructure is concerning. Armed uncrewed aerial vehicles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The Secretary General has unequivocally urged all sides to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, as such use is highly likely to result in indiscriminate harm, including in Ukraine. I take this opportunity to invite all member states to implement the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, adopted in November 2022 in a broad and meaningful manner. The continued and intensified attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and services in Ukraine, including energy infrastructure, health and educational facilities, ports, roads, bridges, and grain facilities remain very much alarming. Under international humanitarian law, parties to an armed conflict are prohibited from targeting civilians and civilian objects, including civilian infrastructure, and have the responsibility to take all feasible precautions in the conduct of military operations to avoid or at least minimize incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. The United Nations strongly condemns attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and urges for their immediate cessation. Mines and explosive remnants of war have resulted in widespread land contamination, rendering land unusable for agriculture, while impeding the movements of people. I reiterate my call to all the relevant parties to abide by their obligations under the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons and not to transfer or use any mines prohibited by its amended Protocol 2. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the past 18 months have seen death, loss, unbearable suffering, and devastation in Ukraine. The world cannot afford for this senseless war to continue. I appeal to all member states to make every effort for peace. As the Secretary General has repeatedly emphasized, the United Nations is committed to support all meaningful efforts to bring a just and sustainable peace to Ukraine, guided by the United Nations Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. George Samuel.